This video is brought to you by Lilo. More about them later in the video. But if you're an educator and you're showing this to a group of students, you might want to skip the sponsored segment. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Ben Edelman. So be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your like, subscribe, and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical places. Let's get to it. Throughout history, the vagaries of war have turned unknown places into household names. Marathon, Hastings, Waterloo, and Gettysburg are all much more famous today than their small size would otherwise merit, simply because a famous battle was fought there. So it is with Bastogne, the small town located in the southeast corner of Belgium. For well over 1,000 years, people lived, worked, and raised their families in Bastogne, largely unnoticed by the rest of the world. But then came the most destructive war the world has ever known. The residents of Bastogne must have thought the worst was over when they were liberated from German occupation in September 1944. But 2 months later, the town became the unintentional centerpiece in German military strategy, a surprise counterattack that would split the Allied armies and perhaps end the war on the Western Front. To accomplish this, they needed to recapture Bastogne, but the American troops defending it were just as determined to keep it, even when they found themselves completely surrounded. It was one of the most violent episodes of the entire war for the US Army, but it also held up as perhaps its finest hour. Today, the name Bastogne is well known, particularly among Americans who lost so many of their sons defending the town and its outskirts. The modern town of Bastogne reflects this, with multiple commemorative sites that attract thousands of visitors from all over the world every year. In many ways, the old Bastogne disappeared after the battle, both figuratively and literally, as its residents had to both rebuild their destroyed homes and cope with the new world they now lived in, where everyone knew the name of their hometown. And now I want to talk to you all man to men. Men, did you know that strengthening your pelvic floor is just as important as, say, working out your abs for endurance and strength? Are you not quite sure what a pelvic floor is? Well, pelvic floor muscles are key to things like core strength, endurance, and get this, bladder control. If your pelvic muscles are weak, you could face challenges like reduced performance, incontinence, and blowing up all over the launch pad. And no, I'm not talking about a rocket launch. Or am I? If one or more of these problems sounds familiar, don't worry, because strengthening these muscles can also improve prostate health by promoting better circulation. And today's sponsor, Lilo, can help you. The Lilo F2S Stamina Trainer is a high-tech male stamina training device that strengthens your pelvic floor with guided exercises conveniently accessed with the Lilo app. Get real-time feedback to optimize your training and performance. Wink, wink. The Lilo app's Kegel exercise program, yes, you heard that correctly, apparently men can do Kegels too. You learn something new every day, right? Will help you strengthen your pelvic floor muscles, enhance control, and improve stamina, support your prostate health, and improve your performance under the covers by promoting better circulation to certain, shall we say, areas. If you're ready to level up your endurance and performance, go ahead and check out Lilo F2S now by heading to the link in the description and pinned comment, and start your pelvic fitness journey today. Bastogne is located in the heart of the Ardennes, a hilly area covered in some of Europe's densest forests. Historically, the region was occupied by Gallic tribes, known as the Belgae, until it was conquered by the Romans under Julius Caesar, who made it the province of Gallia Belgica. The name Bastogne, or at least an early version of it, doesn't appear in historical records until after the Roman Empire had already broken up. However, in 634 AD, being subsequently mentioned in 887. It was part of the Holy Roman Empire in 1332, when John, Count of Luxembourg, granted the city a charter and built a defensive wall around it. The region Bastogne is located in, known historically as the Low Countries, was a source of almost continual friction during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, with constantly shifting borders and repeated military incursion. Over the course of a few centuries, the region was controlled by the Duchy of Burgundy, Spain, Austria, and France, whose king Louis XIV ordered the city walls of Bastogne to be torn down in 1688 when his forces occupied the town. Finally, the Dutch controlled it from 1815 to 1830, after which Belgium gained its independence. The new nation's borders placed Bastogne only 12 kilometers from neighboring Luxembourg. Since Bastogne is located in the southern half of Belgium, Wallonia, its residents speak French, as opposed to the northern province, Flanders, which speaks Dutch. During the 19th century, the Ardennes region helped Belgium become one of Europe's industrial powerhouses thanks to its plentiful supplies of timber and easy access to river ports. Several railway lines were built connecting the town with the rest of the country, and Bastogne became a fairly prosperous town, driven primarily by forestry and cattle industries. Then, like much of the rest of Europe, war came to Bastogne. The town spent the duration of World War I occupied by the Germans, and it had only barely recovered when they came back again in 1940. Being under the thumb of the Kaiser's troops had been bad enough, but what Winston Churchill called the odious apparatus of Nazi rule was even worse. Supplies of most everything, particularly food, dwindled as the country was stripped of resources to feed the insatiable German war machine. 145,000 Belgian civilians were forcibly deported to work in German factories, where they faced appalling conditions and were exposed to Allied bombing from the air. Resistance to the occupiers was met with brutality. The authorities had a standing policy of murdering 5 civilian hostages for every German soldier killed by the resistance. More than 24,000 Belgian Jews, meanwhile, were systematically murdered in concentration camps like Auschwitz. Small wonder then that Bastogne's liberation by US Army troops was met with near universal jubilation in September 1944, 6 days after the recapture of the country's capital, Brussels. As the Allies continued to drive east over the course of the next 3 months, all the way to the German border, most people felt that the war in Europe would soon be over. The Ardennes sector of the front was under the jurisdiction of the U.S. 12th Army Group, commanded by General Omar Bradley. In December 1944, it was considered a quiet sector of the Western European theater. The lines were thinly held, primarily by troops that had been transferred there to rest and recuperate after heavy fighting elsewhere. The winter that year had been unusually severe, much colder and snowier than normal, and Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower was waiting until the worst of it passed before beginning the last big push into Germany itself. At this time, the Allies believed that the Germans were effectively beaten. They did not believe that the Wehrmacht was still capable of offensive action at this time, beset as they were from all sides. They were wrong. Adolf Hitler was unwilling to concede defeat. He still believed that he would be able to figure out a way to restore the situation to his advantage. The Western Allied forces arrayed against him were powerful, but they had 2 prominent weaknesses he planned to exploit: a long, tenuous supply line, and the fact that the American Commander Bradley and his British counterpart, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, had a contentious relationship. The plan Hitler came up with was a modified version of the one used to defeat the Allies in 1940, a surprise attack that would split the Allied armies in 2, cutting a significant portion of them off from the rest without supplies where they could be surrounded and defeated. The goal was the Belgian port of Antwerp, through which most of the Allied supplies and reinforcements were being funneled from Britain and America. It was hoped by Hitler that this attack would shock the Western Allies enough to make a separate peace deal with Germany, which would allow him to turn all his forces east to face the oncoming Soviet juggernaut. The location chosen to launch the attack was also the same as in 1940, the Ardennes. For the Germans, seizing and controlling the town of Bastogne was key to their plans because 7 different roads converged on it. But it wasn't a major objective, merely a stepping stone on their way to Antwerp, 185 kilometers to the northwest. The original German battle plan called for Bastogne to be taken on the 2nd day of the operation by elements of General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. Hopefully I pronounced that right, but really he was a Nazi, so who cares. On December 16, 1944, the Germans began their attack, achieving complete surprise over the shocked Americans, who took some time to fully comprehend the scale of it, which was 3 entire German armies, over 400,000 men in all, accompanied by 500 tanks, including the newest model Panthers and Tigers. To the east of Bastogne, the 28th Infantry Division was hit hard. with many units forced to retreat pell-mell before the German onslaught. While others sought to buy time for reinforcements to slow down the assault, these were almost all wiped out or compelled to surrender. American commanders quickly realized the importance Bastogne had to the momentum of the German attack and were determined to hold it at all costs. The only reinforcements available to go to Bastogne at this point was the 101st Airborne Division, located some 100 miles to the west. The Screaming Eagles were already considered some of the best and most experienced troops in the US Army, having sent paratroopers into Normandy on D-Day and also fighting in the ill-fated Operation Market Garden in Holland. Now they were being yanked away from their well-deserved R&R and dispatched to Bastogne. General Anthony McAuliffe was not supposed to be the commander taking the 101st into battle, but with both of his superiors out of the country, he was the ranking officer now responsible for the defense of Bastogne. His command would grow to include not only the paratroopers, but all of the American troops now in the town, which would eventually grow to include Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, a regiment of tanks that withstood the German assault long enough for the 101st to get into position, as well as a handful of other units, including an artillery battalion composed entirely of African American troops. And yes, the US military was racially segregated during World War II, and a scratch force made up of stragglers from various other units that became known as Team Snafu, a colloquial military acronym that stood for Situation Normal, all f***ed up. By December 21st, facing unexpectedly heavy resistance trying to take Bastogne, the German High Command made the fateful decision to bypass the town with some of their troops in order to continue to push towards Antwerp. The result was that Bastogne and its defenders were surrounded by the enemy, cut off from the rest of the Allied forces. There were still enough German troops in position around the town to outnumber the Americans 5-1, however. On the home front, newspapers printing maps with lines indicating the positions of Allied and German units now showed a large bulge in the Allied lines, stretching some 50 miles wide and 60 miles deep. Reporters soon began referring to the engagement as the Battle of the Bulge, which was certainly more descriptive than the official name for it, the Ardennes Counteroffensive. Located almost in the center of the bulge, the American cordon around Bastogne was suffering badly for its continued resistance. Supplies of everything were running short and had to be rationed. Food, clothing, ammunition, medical supplies. Repeated German shelling destroyed most of Bastogne's buildings, forcing McAuliffe's staff and most of the 4,000 civilians who'd been unable to escape the town before the cordon closed into cramped cellars. The cold was causing as many casualties as the enemy was. More and more people, soldiers and civilians alike, were suffering from ailments like trench foot, frostbite, pneumonia, and dysentery. The weather was abysmal. Persistent and heavy snowfall was preventing the powerful Allied air forces from assisting the trapped troops at Bastogne or resupplying them by air. However, the Americans refused to give up the fight. Men who normally served as clerks, cooks, or police officers were handed rifles and thrown into the fight. Powerful anti-aircraft guns and other artillery pieces were levied against attacking infantry and tanks, with the Americans taking advantage of their short internal lines to quickly move troops and guns to each new trouble spot that appeared. The Germans were also not in as strong of a position as it appeared. The bulk of the 47th Panzer Corps, the unit assigned to take the town, had been sent ahead to support the drive towards Antwerp, leaving General Heinrich von Lüttwitz with only a single battled infantry division and a regiment of tanks to attack the paratroopers and their armored backup. Without approval from his superiors, von Lüttwitz decided to try to bluff the Americans into surrendering by sending a letter to the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The letter encouraged McAuliffe to surrender, otherwise he would be destroyed. McAuliffe had been asleep when the surrender message arrived at his headquarters in Bastogne. Despite their uncomfortable position, the Americans were in no mood to surrender. They were paratroopers after all, they were used to being surrounded by the enemy. When his aides had read the message to him, McAuliffe shook his head and said, "Aw, nuts." The general being one of the few career soldiers who did not use profanity. When the tired commander struggled to compose a response to the surrender demand, one of his aides remarked that he had said it best in his initial exclamation. And so it was that McAuliffe sent his German counterpart a one-word reply: nuts. The Germans didn't understand what it meant. It was explained by an American translation that they could go to hell. It was one of the most publicized moments of the entire American war, boosting morale among all the troops fighting that winter in Europe. Von Lüttwitz's superiors, on the other hand, were furious that he had allowed the enemy to make a fool of all of them, especially since he was unable to carry out his threat to destroy the Americans. The day after the surrender debacle, the skies over Bastogne finally cleared, allowing supply drops of crucially needed supplies to the defenders. Moreover, it allowed the fearsome fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force the window they needed to strafe and bomb German positions in support of the soldiers on the ground. Meanwhile, what many consider the most powerful army America has ever put into the field was on the way to Bastogne. Ever since D-Day, General George Patton's Third Army had been bulldozing its way across Europe and was now poised on the German border, preparing to resume the attack westward. However, Patton immediately understood the threat posed to the Allies by the German advance, and immediately started planning to shift most of his army 90 degrees to attack north instead. It was a daunting prospect. Patton's troops had to fight their way more than 100 miles north without rest or resupply, against an enemy with a lot of experience in defensive warfare. But if General Patton was known for anything, it was his uncanny ability to get the most out of the troops under his command, and they rose to the occasion, smashing their way through the German positions in a matter of days, in one of the most brilliant maneuvers of the entire war. The first of Patton's units to reach Bastogne was a tank battalion commanded by Colonel Creighton Abrams, who would go on to have a long, distinguished army career. The modern M1 Abrams battle tank is named after him. Abrams' breakthrough created a narrow corridor through which the wounded and civilians could be evacuated and supplies and reinforcements brought in, but it didn't end the siege of Bastogne. Fighting would continue in and around the town for weeks until January 16, 1945, when the First Army and the Third Army met, finally closing the Bulge. By that point, Anthony McAuliffe was no longer in charge of the 101st Airborne. Following Bastogne's relief, he'd been personally decorated for valor by General Patton, and then promoted. He would end his career in 1956 as a 4-star general, and in true military fashion, his colleagues and friends referred to him for the rest of his life as Nuts McAuliffe. The Battle of the Bulge was the costliest action of the war for the American Army. It suffered over 80,000 casualties, a quarter of which were suffered in and around Bastogne. The Germans suffered too, between 75 and 100,000 casualties, along with hundreds of tanks and other vehicles that the Wehrmacht was simply unable to replace. To find troops for his counteroffensive, Hitler had to scrape the bottom of the barrel, and his last great gamble had failed. 6 months later, he was dead, and the war in Europe was over. As is the case in any war, the civilians suffered the most. Hundreds of Belgians were killed in and around Bastogne, caught in the crossfire of the furious fighting, or murdered in reprisal actions by the Gestapo who followed after the frontline troops. Inside Bastogne, more than half of its 1,200 homes were either destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. There was scarcely a single building in the town that escaped damage. Many of the smaller villages and hamlets around Bastogne met similar fates, with some entire settlements vanishing from the map. For many Americans, the story of the defense of Bastogne was one of the high points of the war. Most of the laurels were heaped upon the 101st Airborne Division, who became known as the Battered Bastards of Bastogne, while the other units tended to be overlooked. This was to the chagrin of officers like General McAuliffe, who pointed out that without the tanks and artillery and the rest of the defenders, it was likely the paratroopers would have been overwhelmed. The defense of Bastogne has also been highlighted ahead of other important actions taken to blunt the German advance in the Ardennes, with places like Saint-Vith or Elsenborn Ridge garnering a lot less attention. Part of that may be attributable to the fact that so many war correspondents just happened to be in the area when the fight started. For their part, the residents of Bastogne had nothing but praise for their American defenders. In 1946, earth from the town square named Place du McAuliffe after the war was placed into a stone box that had an image of a smashed swastika on it. It was then delivered to President Harry Truman in Washington. In 1950, a massive stone monument, the Martisson Memorial, was unveiled on a hill overlooking Bastogne. In the center of the monument, carved in Latin, is the phrase, "The Belgian people remember their American liberators." It took years for the people of Bastogne to rebuild their community to what it was before the war. For a long time, local farmers and ranchers would find discarded military equipment or even bones in their fields. It was common practice to use scavenged American helmets to feed chickens and cows, while any recovered German helmets were reserved for the pigs. Today, Bastogne is 4 times as big as it was in 1944, with 16,000 inhabitants. Signs of the battle for the town are everywhere, most notably the Sherman tank in the middle of the town square, right next to a memorial bust of German McAuliffe. No less than 4 different museums covering the conflict are currently open for visitors, and reenactments of the battle are held every year in December. An estimated 150,000 people visit the town every year, more than half of them international tourists, particularly Americans. Initially, most of the outside visitors to Bastogne were veterans and their families, but a surge in tourism among a new generation of Americans was driven at least in part by the release in 2001 of Band of Brothers, an HBO miniseries detailing the exploits of paratroopers from the 101st Airborne, including a prominent depiction of the defense of the Belgian town. It also included taped interviews with surviving veterans of the battle, an important historical resource now since, as we approach the 80th anniversary of the fight for Bastogne, fewer and fewer of the first-hand witnesses are still around to pass on their stories. In many ways, the old Bastogne, the one that existed for centuries before the war, died in December 1944. Sure, the buildings were rebuilt, but the sleepy town in the Ardennes that nobody ever heard of ceased to exist after the end of the Battle of the Bulge. The new Bastogne, the one that exists today, is forever marked by the scars of war, just like Gettysburg or Waterloo or 1,000 other small towns all over the world, that nobody would have ever heard of if armies of men determined to kill one another had never clashed within their environs. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a place we should cover next, subscribe and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical places. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.